All right. This is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet, Chapter 24, Section 2, The Russian Empire. So the Russian Empire, during the age of imperialism, has many similarities with the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire was what we covered last section. But there are also some differences. So when talking about Russia, one thing to keep in mind is that Russia is largely an agricultural nation. Most people are farmers, even more so than the Ottoman Empire, especially more so than Europe. So we might say little urban population. There's not a lot of people in Russia between 1800 and 1870 who are living in the cities. And of course, cities are major areas where commerce takes place. So a lot more farmers, a lot less traders. It's also an area in which many different languages are spoken, right? So in this sense, it's very similar to the Ottoman Empire, right? So many languages. And also ethnicities. Right. So in that case, it's very similar to the Ottomans. But one unique aspect to the Russian Empire was the use of serfs. And recall that serfs were peasant workers tied to specific plots of land. We would definitely consider this to be unfree labor. So essentially, we talked about serfs earlier, but a serf is somebody who is legally required to work on a specific plot of land, and they're not allowed to leave. They're not as maybe unfree as slaves, but they're certainly not free laborers. Serfdom was something that became abolished with the French Revolution. But recall that it was Russia who defeated Napoleon. So a lot of the changes that Napoleon put into effect, right, like abolish serfdom, or all the different things that Napoleon did. He abolished serfdom. He abolished essentially monarchy. In this case, it would be the Russian Tsar. And he erased a lot of what we might call noble privileges. And so all of those things, right? Serfdom, the monarchy or the rule of the Tsar, the privileges that nobility enjoyed, all of those things continued to exist in Russia because Napoleon was not successful on the battlefield to change that. So we might say, actually we'll say these things: serfdom, monarchy, noble privileges, everything that the French Revolution sought to overturn, these things all continued in Russia, right? Continued in Russia after that revolution. However, there were some changes going on in the outside world that proved beneficial. Among them was industry. Russian rulers did try to adopt industry, but it relied mostly on foreigners. In other words, the Russians didn't have like a domestic, educated, middle-class, investor class that could finance these factories. And so anything that came in terms of industry, things like factories or railroads, had to be made by foreigners because there was no domestic industry there. So this influence of Western Europe had kind of two different effects on Russia and the Russian elites. Again, most of them still belonging to this noble class. Slavophiles embraced Russian tradition. Right? So these would have been the people that said all these changes being brought about in Western Europe are a bad idea. Russian tradition, we could say this is pretty much Tsardom, right? So the Tsar is the rightful ruler. Maybe not serfdom, but certainly peasantry, to embrace, kind of the agricultural and rural makeup of Russia, and the church, or specifically the Orthodox Church. And so that is to reject urbanization, reject any sort of democratic government, reject all those things. And Slavophiles and people who embraced Russian tradition, again, kind of served in some similarities within the Ottoman Empire as those classes that really rejected some rule. However, the Slavophiles, they didn't really win out in the long run. Russia does continue to establish reforms, but they also coincided pretty well with another growing movement, and that is Pan-Slavism. And Pan-Slavism was something that sort of tentatively embraced Russian tradition, but more embraced Slavic nationalism. And again, nationalism was an idea that was unleashed by the French Revolution. The idea is being, proud of one's nation. In terms of Slavic nationalism, we're looking mostly at religion, so Orthodox Christianity. We're looking at the Greek alphabet being used to write with. And this was especially prevalent in areas where large Slavic populations live. So there are a lot of Orthodox Christians and people who use Greek who lived in the Austrian Empire, who are mostly German-speaking, Latin-using, and could be Catholic, and the Ottoman Empire. And the idea behind Pan-Slavism was that all people of sort of this Slavic nationality should be under one nation. And of course, that one nation should be Russia. So in other words, all Slavic people should belong to the Russian Empire, which again sort of fit pretty well with this idea of embracing Russian tradition, because for the most part, Russians were primarily Orthodox as well, and also used the Greek alphabet. So a lot of cultural connection going on there. The Russian state continued to expand westward and southward, and that was simply because their neighbors to the west and south were a lot less powerful. If you're looking at Russia on a map to the east, this would be Europe. And again, those are the industrializing nations. To the south is the Ottomans. Over here is India. And to the west would be the Pacific Ocean. And so the Russians were successful in spreading, towards Ottomans, towards India, and towards the Pacific Ocean. Vladivostok is a port city, so we're going to say a Russian port city on the Pacific Ocean, right? So the Russians did have an influence in the Pacific. The Russians annexed territories like Georgia, Armenia, and Chechnya. These are in Central Asia. Would have been located, if we're using this as a map, they're kind of located in between the Ottoman Empire and India. And of course, India at this time is largely British. The British are exercising a lot of control in there. So Georgia, Armenia, Chechnya, Central Asia, we could just say Russia annexed, right? Annex means to take over. And then lastly, this expansion put them into competition with the Qing dynasty of China, the Ottoman Empire of the Middle East, and Great Britain. So these all became rivals to Russia as a result of them continuously putting pressure on these various parts of the world here. In terms of culture, looks like we left out Peter the Great's ruling there. But in terms of culture is something that marks the Russian Empire a little bit differently than their counterparts. Is that, Orthodox Christianity and the Greek alphabet, they were foreign to Western Europe. Western Europe was either Protestant Christianity or Catholic. And in Western Europe, they used the Latin alphabet and speak the Latin languages. So there certainly was some sort of sense of foreignness to Russia, but it wasn't as foreign as the Ottoman Empire, which at the very least you can contrast the Ottomans as being a primarily Islamic state. At least there is some sort of semblance of Christianity that still exists between Western Europe and Russia. At the same time, so we'll go ahead and say cultural trends. We'll say that Russia was more familiar with Europe. All right, Russia was more familiar with Europe. One person who is largely responsible for that is Peter the Great. Recall in a previous chapter, we talked about how Peter the Great traveled to Europe, brought back European ideas. He required people in Russia to shave their beards like Europeans did. He built the city of Petersburg, the capital of Russia, literally closer to Europe. So Peter the Great had created Russian, European ties. So there's a little bit more familiarity there. However, most of the Russian ruling class continued to resist any sort of change. Again, kind of the trifecta of what the Russian class wanted to embrace. Again, Tsardom, that's the ruler of the Tsar as the absolute ruler. Peasantry, that is a largely agricultural Russia, and the Orthodox Church. However, members of the Russian army revolted. The Decembrist revolt was a revolt of Russian army to, and again, we're going to use this term modernize. That means just to embrace new ideas. You can think about the opposite of modernize as tradition. Revolt of the Russian army to modernize, but it ultimately failed. Russian rulers continued to resist any efforts to change Russia until that of Alexander II. And what prompted huge change by Alexander II, Tsar, between 1855 and 1881, was Russia's loss in the Crimean War. And typically, historically, major catalysts to change taking place in a country is a loss in a war, because that causes the nation who lost the war to kind of reflect and to change on what was necessary. Alexander II's reforms included the emancipation of the serfs, which came in 1861. This was after slavery had been abolished in places like Great Britain, approximately the same time that slavery is being abolished in the United States, 1860, so very late. The creation of joint stock companies, which would create a wealthy non-nobility class in Russia. Again, this would be the class that then could promote or provide industry without having to rely on foreigners. And lastly, the construction of railroads to make Russia a more efficient state.